Hey everyone, welcome to Arc Studio Presents. I'm Micah Craddy, a screenwriter and the head of writing at Arc Studio, which is the greatest screenwriting app in the world. You just saw a little bit of it in that video. It's pretty cool. You can outline an entire season of TV and then the individual episodes, and then write this the script. Or of course, you can start with just a script and outline that. We're gonna put a discount link in the chat in later on, so you'll be able to get $30 off the first year of Arc Studio Pro if you want to check it out. In just a moment, I'm going to bring Andrew and Gabe onto the stage. I'm super excited to talk about them about their career, about their writing process, and what is it like to write in one of these big studio franchises with all the execs and producers and the cinematic universe. And it's going to be a really great conversation. But first, I just wanted to have one quick announcement. We're doing this thing called Write With Us, which maybe some of you guys have come to before. It's pretty cool. But basically, we're doing once a week on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Timed writing sprints. Like a community, everyone comes together and we do writing sprints together and talk about screenwriting. And it's just a place where you can get some writing done in the middle of the week and, I don't know, be with a community of screenwriters, which is really cool. So I'm going to put that in the chat. You can check out the event, RSVP, if you like. I'll also drop this discount link in the chat if you want to check out Arc Studio Pro and get $30 off. And now let's put our virtual hands together for the stars of tonight, Andrew and Gabe. Hey guys, how's it going?
What's up, man? How you doing?
Yeah, oh, of course. Thank you so much for being here. I'm super stoked to talk to you guys about the whole deal, the whole gambit. I think you guys have had a pretty exciting career so far. And the fact that you're a writing team just adds a different dimension to it, which is pretty cool. But I want to start there. How did you guys end up as a writing team?
So this goes back to NYU. We were we met freshman year, and we were friends basically right away. And then we lived together sophomore year, and
sort of community of film people, film buddies, right? Everybody was
the little film posse.
Yeah, we had a film posse for sure, and that was kind of how we partied sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
It was always part of the conversation.
Yeah,
right?
Ain't no party like a Truffaut party. A little bit.
Yeah, we can do this. Let's get into making movies, right?
Yeah. We discovered a lot of filmmakers together, watched a lot of our favorite movies together for the first time. Our sophomore year roommate actually went on to work at Cinetic right out of college and put us together with our first manager. So there was a lot of kind of that right time, right place situations. But then we lived together again after college. And I was reading scripts for a little indie company in New York, and Gabe was working for an artist. And we were living in this little apartment in Chinatown, and we were watching tons of movies. I was reading tons of scripts. I was bringing them home and showing them to Gabe, and we were talking about the art form. And obviously it's something that we'd been talking about doing a lot. We'd worked together on a photojournalism project, so it wasn't like we'd never done anything creative together. And then
too, because this was a little production company, and his job was to read every script that came through. So he's bringing home scripts that were from just a housewife in Omaha who wrote a script and sent it to the first company they could find in New York. So we weren't reading the best stuff.
Yeah, right? I mean, I don't think we should downplay what a housewife in Omaha can do, because there can be some mad skills there.
No, they could definitely do well, but this wasn't we're not reading sort of professional screenwriting here. We're reading first stab, everybody's first script. So we got to read a lot of stuff where we were we could do this.
You could do that, right? You're not reading because I feel there's a lot of things where you see people be certain art inspires you and certain art intimidates you, where you're oh my God, there's I could never do that. But yeah.
And I think there really was sort of a barrier to entry at that point, because I think probably for everybody, it's like, how do you go from haven't written anything to being a working screenwriter? And it feels like there's just this big hump, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So we just like took that on really fast. And I think reading a bunch of scripts that felt like that we could do better was a big part of giving us the confidence.
What kind of stuff were on the, so that's kind of like on the confidence boosting side, but on the inspirational side, you guys mentioned you're watching a lot of movies, both this time and the first time you lived together. What was going like into the hopper? Like what kind of films were you guys geeking out on?
Well, at around that time, we discovered New Wave. So it was like we were watching a lot of Godard. We were watching Truffaut. We watched, Breathless and Contempt and Band Apart and movies like that, and sort of like getting a sense of like what that kind of cool was. And it was funny because we were working on this script, Die in a Gunfight, and we were writing from a point of view where neither of us studied. I took a screenwriting course in college, but like neither of us had studied the craft all that deeply, and so we were approaching it from like this really sort of blue sky point of view, and like the first draft of our screenplay was like 175-page abomination, where we were playing with a lot of different ideas. And it was funny because like at a certain point we were watching Band Apart, and we looked at each other and we were like, oh, we're kind of like, we didn't even know we were ripping this movie off, but we were ripping this movie off. And so we started to sort of realize like which sort of cultural influences had made its way to us through other cultural influences. Like, we were influenced by Tarantino, who was influenced by Godard. So we were like sort of tapping the source of our influence in a more direct way.
It's like when you watch when you watch The Simpsons, like you grow up watching The Simpsons, and then you're like suddenly years later see the thing, you're like, oh, that's they didn't. That's where that came from. Like, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, we were having, because we weren't sort of students of film at the time, we were just sort of like casual students at that time, and we were just discovering a lot of stuff. It was also kind of a good era. There was a lot of good movies came out around then. I just remember specifically that we would go to the movie theater a lot in New York. One that jumps out was There Will Be Blood. Being able to like seeing that in,
I mean, that was such a great year. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And I know that there were some other good ones that year.
No Country for Old Men.
Exactly. And when we start to cite our influences, like we really, it's funny because like when you're in our age group and you're interested in film, you name a bunch of names and it's like, well, obviously it's like, it's P.T. Anderson, it's Wes Anderson, it's the Coen brothers, it's Tarantino, it's Fincher, it's like we like all the movies you'd expect us to like based on
Michael
like
Mann.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Tons,
By the way,
wow.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. We also got a call a woman under the influence poster behind you. Gabe. Appreciation there.
Right on. It's become sort of a talking point in a lot of our work calls.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that people notice it because it calls out Gina much bigger. So I'm always thinking that like my head is in the way of it. And I'm like, I think it's kind of cool that people recognize the movies so much. That's great. Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, I'm in my girlfriend's office right now, and she has this Polish alien poster up, which is one of my favorite things.
Oh hell yeah!
I love
that's what I like a good movie poster. This is like a real one. Like this was in a I think it says 2nd Avenue and 64th Street. This actually hung up in the subway.
Oh, that's awesome.
Somebody like rescued it, and I managed to buy it from like from a poster dealer.
Let's jump into okay, so you're getting all these influences, you're watching all this stuff, you're reading all the scripts. How does the partnership itself start to form? You mentioned you had done one project, kind of a photo or type project before, I think you said.
Yeah.
So how does writing a movie together or whatever the script was, how does that develop?
it's funny because when we first started, it was the two of us sitting side by side at a desk at the same computer, just coming up with scenes like on the fly. And it was like, it was sort of a ridiculous, like when we first started writing the screenplay to when we actually sold it, I think there was probably like about like a 2-year process there where we went from being absolute goofballs who had no clue what we were doing to people who had started to almost kind of study the craft on the fly. So it was like, at first it was us sitting side by side at a computer late into the night, just coming up with completely absurd ideas. We're like, hey, wouldn't it be interesting if suddenly our characters could teletransport to the top of a mountain and go skiing? And we were like, that's awesome. Let's do it. And so the script was just loaded with these insane ideas that we would then, I think one of the things I always say to young writers, and especially about the early stages, is like, I think that something that we had going for us is that we were humble enough at that point to know that what we were doing wasn't good. Mm-hmm. And so our first like 5 drafts never saw the light of day, with the exception of like 5 or 6 of our closest friends that we would write their name on the cover page and hand them out in hard copy and get notes back from them. And slowly but surely it went from this like unreadable load of garbage to something that actually started to kind of take on an interesting shape.
Well, it also kind of pointed out, I think, 2 different things for us, which is the writing and the storytelling. And that's something that we started to learn over time. And we realized early on that even though the storytelling was kind of garbage, the writing showed like promise. People liked the way that we were writing things. Mm-hmm. They liked our naivete, if you want to call it that, or like we were having fun with it. It was loose.
It's kind of like the Shane Black style, right? Of just sort of like having fun with it, like his sort of style. It's like you enjoy reading a script that he wrote, like it's as a read itself. Yeah,
and I think the read of a script is incredibly important. Yeah, about as important, not as important as the story, but the read is just, at least for us and for people like making a career like us, the read is what gets people kind of coming back to us, because you start to parse out like, what are your real strengths here? And I think early on, it felt like our strengths were an ability to write, an ability to write a certain way. And over the years, we developed this very nuanced ability to tell stories. That's the shit that comes with like 15 years of just doing it constantly. But that little kernel of being able to just write and have fun with it is kind of the football that we just like ran with.
It's what they call voice, right? And it's like I like people very early on they would always say that they liked the voice in that screenplay. And like, it was, I think, just sort of partially because we were having a lot of fun. And also because we were like, in a weird way, lucky to not know the rules. Like oftentimes, if you read the screenplay of someone who's coming out of a college program who really knows the rules, it's sort of like, you can tell that someone sort of understands what the market wants and what studios expect and how an exec likes to read a script, and it's formatted that way, and the length is according to sort of the tastes of the day. And back then, if you read, Pulp Fiction, like no one but Tarantino could have gotten away with that, but we didn't know that at the time. We were like, here's a great script, we can do it like that, and just went nuts.
Yeah, go crazy. Yeah, we were watching experimental stuff, excited by experimental stuff. So that was pretty much what we got into.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned strengths, and I think that's interesting. I want to focus in a little bit on the partnership. When you guys are in these early days, are you finding that one of you is better at one aspect and the other is better at other aspects, or are you both kind of bringing the same strengths to the table?
I think we've like been learning that about ourselves over the entire experience of working together. I think there were certain things that were kind of obvious about like one strengths versus the other strengths, just in terms of like thinking. like Andrew thinks differently than I think. And it's nice because he sort of like covers bases that I don't cover, right? So we do have like kind of a whole brain approach, but like we've been wondering that the whole time, and it seems to like kind of keep crystallizing, and we kind of seem to keep kind of filling in the gaps, right? It's one of those weird things, like you just kind of we're not really sure what it is.
and it oftentimes I think will evolve from project to project depending on what we're covering. I mean, early on in our career, the joke was, because I studied philosophy and he studied art. So if you take philosophy and art and combine them, you get something kind of like cinema. And it's and like I think that like if you were to sort of be really reductive about it, Gabe is very visual and very artistic, and I'm very analytical and word based. And so, when it comes to crafting a scene, I'll approach it very analytically, and then Gabe will sort of take a step back and sort of be like, well, okay, but what's the underlying thing here? Or how can we make it special by doing something you wouldn't expect here or here? And so there is sort of like, I'm a little bit more OCD. So like, I'll be very detail oriented and like, but again, like from project to project, sometimes, we'll find
totally flip in unexpected ways. Which is nice. I mean, that's like what we always liken it to, kind of being in a band. It's kind of like being in a marriage too. Yeah. We're very good at that. We get into like really fun fights with each other and then like apologize. Like really sweet.
Have some makeup writing.
It's like really adorable about 100%. Like when we're like fighting and then like makeup and stuff. Yeah. But the same thing like with a band, it's just sort of like sometimes it kind of clicked, right? Like something clicked and it's worked and it's been working.
What are the other benefits? Like, I mean, obviously bringing different strengths is great, but it must be nice to like have someone in it with you, right? Like you're not going through it alone, all the ups and downs.
It seems insane not to in some way, like because screenplays, you're never, whatever, you could write something that is genius and you hand it in to the studio and you share it with your director and you get reams of notes back and the script changes 80 to 90% most of the time, and so we have the luxury of being able to sort of we've done that in-house before we experienced that, so it's like so many different eyes are going to approach the project and so many different opinions are going to come to bear on it that we at least are able to say, okay, we can evaluate each other's thoughts and each other's reactions to sort of how to construct a story and then how to also respond to notes. Like if I had to go
really good at having like internal dialogue.
Yeah.
To do what I think we feel like we do all the time, right? Like you're just like to be able to like constantly have that make you go insane.
It's funny because I kind of like that is my writing process. Like I write to myself. Like I will be like, so what are we doing now? Like I literally feel kind of schizophrenic sometimes when I'm writing. Like I sort of have a dialogue with myself on it and like take myself out of it in order to like get some perspective and be able to like look at it slightly. Like if you looked at my note,
it's that like perspective thing. It's also like the business can at times be heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And we've said like we're not sure if we'd really want to be doing this like without each other, because sometimes you just get these devastating notes or sort of feedbacks on things where it's just like, how would you deal with that by yourself? Yeah. Right. Like we get to like kind of suss them out together. It's like, so what do you think about this? What do I think about this? Here's the outcome. It's not as bad as we initially thought it was. Actually, we could do this. We could do this. It's straightforward. So it's the ability to really work. It feels like a very collaborative art form. So it's just been pretty natural for us to kind of do it as a duo.
That's awesome. I had a question here from the audience about the writing partnership. I think it's interesting. When forming a writing partnership, what is your process for maintaining a cohesive look for the script during the writing process? Like, I guess I would also say, kind of twist that a little bit to like, how do you guys stay aligned? Well, first off, let's go back to the beginning. Like, how do you agree on a vision for what the project is at the beginning? How do you both get aligned on that? And then how do you kind of together stay on that course?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Again, it's like, I think it's sort of person to person, situational. Like, we have our kind of situation where before we start getting into something, we usually have fully aligned on our vision. That might mean we talked for 72 hours.
Is there a formal process? Do you guys go to a bar? Are you Zooming? Are you like what? How are you doing this?
We're usually in different towns and sometimes states. So we're talking every day a lot. And then when it comes to the aesthetics of the script, we're working that out together. Like, sometimes we're just working through the script at the same time, and we'll be like, should we format this like this? I don't know. Like, that looks kind of weird. Like, and then it's like, all right, no, that is better. So let's go back and like find all the other examples and like replace it all the way up. That one's better. Like, we're gonna go with that, right? Like, and so we're kind of constantly evolving our. I think we both feel like the aesthetics of a script are pretty important. I think the way that your eye can travel,
like the white space and everything.
Yeah. And we've arrived at things. It's like, over the years, when we first started, we didn't bold our scene slugs, for example. But like, the day came when we were like, I was reading a script the other day and I kind of like how it's bolded. Let's start bolding our slugs. And we're like, cool, let's do that. And then sometimes we'll make a decision. And it's funny, we've actually, in a recent screenplay, we talked about it like at length, where we were moving through a lot of interior spaces from like room to room. And, we didn't want to do interior hotel, this room, interior hotel, that room. So we just started removing interior from all the slugs and just kind of started to cheat it.
It felt like we were cheating a little bit. Like it, it's the whole idea of kind of like a secondary location.
Yeah.
And technically, if you're within one location, you don't have to, but depending on the situation, it's all situational, right? So it's like, we were like, maybe we could do that. Maybe it feels like a little radical for some reason. Like,
I think that's really like important to note, because a lot of screenwriters, especially beginning screenwriters, get very hung up on formatting. Which I understand, because like no one wants to seem like an amateur, right? Like no one wants that. And there are certain things, you need to do. But I think it's important to be like, writers like aren't even consistent among themselves. Like you said, you weren't bolding slug lines, and then you did bold slug lines. So like in the big debate about bolding slug lines, you're on both sides of it, So like there is like, you don't need to worry about that. Like you can evolve
from story to story.
Yeah.
Right. Like certain stories want more, like there's certain scripts we've worked on where we feel comfortable having almost paragraphs of scene direction. And then there's certain scripts where it feels like everything needs to be kind of like one sentence, because again, it kind of comes down to the way your eye is traveling across the page in a way that feels like the process of reading it is the process of watching the movie the way that you've seen it. Right. So if you have to read something that stops you for 30 seconds and read all of this, then that should only work in a situation where that feels appropriate. But if you're in maybe like a thriller and somebody's like moving through a dark hallway and upstairs, like that, you want that to kind of travel. Right. And so it just has to be, I think it's as much a sort of a literary question as it is a visual question, and knowing how people read is a big thing.
Yeah.
You want to make sure that your screenplay, like if you're breaking the rules, I think that you just want to make sure, especially if you're a young writer, you want to make sure that you're breaking the rules for a reason. It's not just like, oh, I want my page to look funky. Like if the story really works for that purpose.
I mean, Jonathan here in the chat just pointed out Oppenheimer being written in the first person, right? Like that's crazy.
Yeah.
You'd never do that. Why would you ever do that? But then you do it because it's the way that you want to tell this story.
Although that's a really good example of like when you're getting into the business, if you're trying to break in and get noticed, Nolan did that. Right. I wouldn't recommend that, like, the average writer trying to break in was, it's like, he earned the right to be that outside of the box,
Right.
So, but it is,
at the same time, I wouldn't tell somebody not to do it at the same time, because it's kind of like, it's just situational. You have to be aware of the fact that, like, if you're doing something like that, it's going against the grain. People, there's a whole, there's thousands of people in Hollywood whose job it is to read scripts constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Yours obviously wants to float to the top. And what is it that makes it be the thing that makes them like it a little more than others? Sometimes it's
no, that's a good point. Like
it's the writing. Yeah. Sometimes it's like, maybe that's the idea that suddenly makes them be like, oh my God, this is fucking crazy. I don't want to make this movie, but this writer is clearly like a psychopath.
This writer has a voice. Let's put this script on the blacklist suddenly, And just to make sure that we're answering the other half of the question, I think that when it comes to, like, obviously you when you're comfortable with another writer, and you really have to be, and I think that, like, the intangible is you actually have to be friends, because you are going to fight. You are going to have differences of opinion. And so, eventually what you have to get used to is the fact that you're going to be rewriting each other all the time. So you're finding sort of the aesthetics, like, if Gabe's saying, hey, I think we should capitalize this particular word for this particular reason. If I haven't done it, when I go back into a scene that I've written and handed off to him, it'll come back to me and that word will be capitalized, and we'll start to find that uniformity. But then also on the front end, from a story point of view, I think that, like, it's very important, especially if you're writing, if you're pitching and to studios and writing studio projects, like, it's very important to outline and have your story figured out. But if you're writing with another person, the most collaborative stage is when you're breaking story. The 72 hours where we're on the phone that Gabe mentioned, that's where we're breaking story and getting our pitch in order. And then comes the process where we really break down the movie scene by scene. And then usually what will happen is we'll say, okay, which scenes are you gravitating toward? And we'll start to write different scenes, but we know exactly what those scenes are going to accomplish, because we've carted them out so specifically. So there's no surprises. It's not like, wait, what did you do over here? I don't get this, because we've already discussed it ad nauseum.
That's awesome. Exactly. And it's nice because there's like, and we figured that out over time, right? Like being able to outline heavily. And that means sort of like outlining the narrative structure of your movie, right? Which is a thing that we like to be sort of loosey-goosey on sometimes. Mm-hmm. We don't want it to be too rigid, but we do want it to have kind of like a logic to it. But when it comes down to like a scene, like, here's this scene, it's like, we'll talk forwards and backwards and all angles of it on, like, what's the scene accomplishing, who's in it, what we're not dictating the dialogue to each other, but it's like, what is it really at its core kind of trying to accomplish? And as long as we are both on the same page about that, then we do get some good surprises sometimes. Yeah. Then it's like, when Andrew might write a scene with like some dialogue where it's like, I love that dialogue, or like I can like respond to it being like, well, I love that dialogue, but I can like even add this other thing to it, and suddenly, but we're working toward the same goal. And it's just like making sure the goal is there is super important.
When you started out, were you more protective about like my joke or my line being in the script, or were you pretty comfortable?
Probably, yeah, right, Andrew? Like,
I don't know. I feel like, I mean, maybe we probably, there's always been things that were like, oh, I love this. This is really great. We can't mess with this. But I feel like because early on, our process was literally like us tapping at the same computer. Like, I couldn't have, I mean, with the early scripts, I couldn't have told you who even wrote what. It was almost like every word was sort of co-written. But there's
like,
absolutely,
you always have to like bite your lip a little bit if like it's like
yeah, I love that line. And it's,
yeah. So how do you approach it? We got this question here. So how do you have to, if one of you thinks that the thing the other person loves just is not working, you know, like how do you kill their darling, you know, as the phrase goes?
Just
hack
it off, like violently hack it off and act like it never happened and like act like it never existed. I think is how we generally go about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's it's in the first stage of the writing. I think that we almost approach every scene knowing that it's going to change a lot. So if there's something, there are like that, you know, if there's something that we feel is really important in the first stage of the writing, it's almost like we've probably already figured that out together. But there are moments where, you know, like we're in such constant contact that like it's not uncommon that, you know, I'll get a call from Gabe. I know he's editing. I handed off some pages to him and he's editing them, and he'll call me and he'll be like, so I think we have to talk about this scene. And then we'll just sit and talk about it. And sometimes it's for 5 minutes and sometimes it's for 5 hours. And we'll, you know, it's like, I think what works is with us is that best idea always does tend to win, where like, if a scene, if a line I love or a scene that I love is changing in a dramatic way, I'll like fight for it up until the point where I'm like, ah, shit, you're right. And then we get there.
It seems like you have to love the project more than you love your contribution to it, right? Because then you're like, oh, I don't want the project to suffer by having the thing that I love, you know, like,
for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that we both understand that sort of like every project kind of has its true north and truth to it. And we've already agreed on that. And we understand kind of what this is tonally, you know, all the elements, right? And so sometimes it might be like you liked it for some other reason, but it really wasn't. We could talk about it and get it back to its true north, and it's like getting rid of that doesn't even matter anymore. It's really, I think it's always, I think something that we've learned over the years is just making sure that we're not entering into our projects half-cocked. You know, like we spend as much time as we have to spend going in to feel as though we've both kind of already watched the movie in our head.
Yeah.
Right. Like beginning to end, tonally, maybe the jokes aren't written, but the moments of humor exist. The dramatic moments exist. Like we kind of get it beginning to end and know where it's going. And then everything is sort of like, well, does that really serve that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can definitely sense, I think that we probably know, even like, I don't even know if we could quantify how we know, but I think that we probably know instinctively when we come across a line that the other person's proud of. And it's like, okay, if I'm going to change this, I'm either going to call before I do it, or I'm going to leave a note that says, here's why.
Yeah.
We do that a lot. Lots of script notes where we're like explaining why we made a cut here or something there.
Well, that's all. I want to, so this is, I mean, I love just this craft discussion. But I want to take a slight detour back to the career, because I think people want to know, like, all right, you're writing together as nobodies, and now you're writing for Marvel and stuff. So like, how does that happen? What I think it's that script, which is over Andrew's right shoulder and that you were writing, but give us the process of how you kind of went and started building that heat and then how that heat you were able to turn it into a sustainable career.
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
It was a long process. So off the strength of Die in a Gunfight, there was this like whirlwind phase where we really quickly got a manager who really quickly got the script out to the Mark Gordon company, who came on really quickly and then got it really quickly into the hands of Zac Efron, who was like just transitioning sort of out of his High School Musical phase into like the next phase of his career. And he was looking for something edgy, and he signed on to do it. And then obviously like it went through a million iterations between then and what actually came out. But the heat off of that was like, before we even really understood what was happening, we were going out to LA to meet with all the agencies, and we signed with WME after this huge sort of, round of meetings. And we were, meeting with Zach and talking about the movie and meeting with the director and getting that going. And then we made the Blacklist. So the heat
was
around
the Blacklist, was the heat starting before the Blacklist, or did the Blacklist accelerate?
The heat started because of the Zac Efron attachment.
Okay. Yeah. And then the Blacklist was like the thing that kind of went like, it was like, oh, something's happening. And then the list came out, and then bang.
Yeah. And then, I would say that like an important thing to like a very important part of that is like all that heat got us an agent, and they fought for us because they just wanted us. They, they were like as an entity, and then you kind of had to like maintain it. So it went like kind of like, and then we were sort of like coasting for a little while, and it was a matter of like, how do we maintain? It's not like, oh, that first script that we wrote is gonna send us to the Oscars and make us $1 million. It's like that. We figured out pretty quickly that that's not how it was going to go. But, I think probably a lot of credit goes to having good reps, but they just kept putting us in front of the right people and in the right projects. And we wrote like a lot of bullshit, for years.
But you were getting paid to write bullshit.
Exactly.
Yeah, because we basically, before we were learning everything on the fly, and basically we learned what like an open writing assignment was like at the same time that we were pitching for them. So suddenly we were pitching for like, a feature version of Sabrina the Teenage Witch that never got made. And we were pitching on, a project called The Magic Castle, which has been rewritten 100,000 times. And, taking studio, we adapted a YA book called Legend that was sort of positioned to be a Hunger Games that never got made. So there's this whole sort of industry in the screenwriting business of competing for these open writing assignments, and you're paying your bills because you're getting hired to write the screenplay. But a lot of these movies, a great many of these movies don't get made. And so you're kind of like treading water in this in-between phase of like, yeah, I'm working in the business, but I'm not making any movies. And that sort of process lasted a couple years.
But it was awesome for us, by the way.
Yeah.
That was effectively our like education.
Yeah, that's when we became professionals.
And you were getting paid to go to college.
We were getting paid. We were working constantly, like kill yourself levels, like never giving up, like just always writing, and it was exhausting. But we did the old like 10,000 hours thing.
Yeah.
Like we didn't really have a clue what we were getting into. And then we've been in like pitch meetings with like presidents of studios with no idea what the fuck we were even doing there. Like we're just like fish out of water, like little scared little puppies in this room, had no concept and no preparation, right? And you just like kind of learn through those. And luckily we were able to like kind of persevere through it. It was just like a lot of like working. I wouldn't say until like maybe 5 years ago did we start saying like, all right, now we really want to start only choosing projects that we think are going to get made.
Yeah. And the thing that got us to a place where we had that luxury was, you know, in the midst of all these open writing assignments, we're learning how to become more professional writers. We're learning how to approach meetings in more professional ways. We're coming of age as screenwriters, but we're also meeting people. And eventually kind of, you know, luckily met a few people who put us in the exact right place we needed to be in order to land the script doctoring gig for Ant-Man. And that was the transitional, that was the real, okay, you're now exiting the period of just hustling for open writing assignments day in and day out, writing, watching your sort of screenplays get dashed against the rocks. Yeah. Now you're on set making a big movie and you have a track record. And that was a major change for us.
I want to jump, I think we skipped one thing, but like, I want to get into the Marvel stuff, but how did you get the manager at the very, was it a connection you had or a cold query or what?
This is the luck of the draw. So it's like, I guess this is like the one thing that maybe, you know, if we were to say this, if you could frame advice out of this, it would be, we went to a school where people were interested in the same things that we were interested in. So like, you know, it was a very sort of NYU thing that happened. Like our sophomore year roommate, Gabe and I lived in a room with our friend Steve, who went to work for a management company. And when we were handing our scripts to our best friends with their names on the front and getting notes back, Steve was one of those guys. And so when we were like, okay, you know what? It's been through 15 drafts. We actually think it's legible now and we're proud of it. Steve was like, well, can I walk it down the hall? And that's how we got a manager.
Yeah. So it was a little bit charmed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Only because it was charmed in the sense that happened, and then it was charmed in the sense that script sold, obviously.
I think that's the crazy part. The fact that it sold is the thing that never happens, that happened. But I mean, one thing I've said, like on almost all of these probably, is like the way Hollywood works is that someone passes a script on to someone else. So like that part, that makes sense, right? Because that's how the industry works, is like you get it to someone who can get it to someone, and you have someone who, you know, will go to bat for you, who cares about you enough to pass on that script. And sort of, in a sense, they're kind of putting themselves on the line a little bit, saying like, hey, I vouch for this script. I like this script. So, you know, it has to be good. And then it goes from there.
Well, I think that it goes back to what I was saying before, in the sense that like, we all read a lot of scripts, and what I've learned is that it's the ones that really kind of float to the top aren't necessarily because your story concept is like the best story concept ever, that like just needs, you know, so much stuff comes out, right? So it's like you're never reading something and being like, oh, this is just like the most incredible story. It's always the writing. And so you read something from somebody who is new, and it sticks with you. You're like, wow, like this person's actually like really good at this, right? Like they have like a real ease, and they write well. They write screenplays well, which is like its own kind of thing. So it's never really like idea to idea. It's just your ability to write, and your ability to write screenplays well. And I've noticed that when reading other people's stuff, is just like the ones that I like want to send off to other people, is just like, wow, this person is just good at this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that takes work. That takes a lot of time.
It does.
Yeah. To do it. All right. So we were kind of going through the trajectory. I think we can kind of keep going along that line. By the way, everyone, thank you for your questions. I see them all. I'll try to get to as many as I can. I see some people are like putting them in repeatedly. Don't worry, I'm seeing them. We'll get to as many as we can. But I want to continue along this journey, because you guys mentioned the script doctor job on Ant-Man. So you're credited for Ant-Man and the Wasp, but we're talking about the first Ant-Man movie. Right. So first off, what is a script doctor? And second, then, how did you get that job?
So we had met Peyton Reed, who directed the Ant-Man movies, in a general meeting as just kind of part of the phase of our career where we were out competing for gigs, doing open writing assignments, meeting people, tons of general meetings is what they call them. And we had a really great meeting with Peyton where we were just talking about Ant-Man wasn't even on the radar for any of us at that point. So we just talked about things we were interested in and sort of had like a rapport. And then when the news dropped, maybe 6 months to a year later, that Edgar Wright was leaving the project and that Peyton had come on to take over, and that Marvel was looking for someone to come on to work on the script, to basically live on set and handle the day-to-day. Our manager sort of immediately called and got us a conversation that Peyton knew who we were and remembered us. And so he was like, yeah, let's hear from them. And so we had a really good meeting with Brad Winderbaum, the executive, who had read our open writing assignment script, Sabrina the Teenage Witch. So sort of a full circle moment where like a lot of these scripts that weren't taking us anywhere, suddenly this writing sample got us hired by Marvel because they liked that script so much. And Peyton liked us.
That's a very common thing in the sense, right, that like these meetings you have, the connections you're making along the way, most of the time they pay fruit 5-10 years down 100%. The line, right? When it all comes full circle.
Yeah, and these scripts that hopefully you got paid a little bit of money for and did a great job on turn into samples.
Calling cards
that people have read and they're like, oh yeah, I remember that one. That was a really fucking good script, and so that's what you can, because every time we're up for something new, if somebody hasn't read us, it's always like, what do we send them? And so we have these scripts that's like, well, this is most representative of us, right? And so that was what fortunately happened in that situation. It was also funny because I remember it going down in the sense that like they needed somebody down there in I think 4 weeks in like Atlanta, Georgia in the summertime, and like it was very quick. So like fortunately a lot of writers who had like families and stuff weren't gonna just pick up their life and go.
Yeah.
And Andrew and I were like,
Atlanta.
I'm already there.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
And in this process, just to kind of make it clear to everyone who may be like, wait, what? Like filming and everything. The script's already been written, right? Like perhaps many writers have already worked on this script. I don't know how many there were along the way in the development process of the first Ant-Man movie.
Yeah.
But so your job isn't to come up like with the script as most of us think, and like we've talked about coming up with scripts and writing them. You're there to be on set for things that come up kind of and like need changes to be made, or it's not working, so we need to try something else, or what's
that was sort of the job title. And so the script had already been written. The original script was Joe Cornish and Edgar Wright. And then by the time we got down there, Paul Rudd and Adam McKay had done a draft. And I think that it may have even gone through a few more hands. But when we went down there, I think to their credit, what was cool is that even though we were down there to sort of just be the writers who plugged things in when necessary, when we were on set, because it was all going to be this amorphous thing that was changing every day, they also wanted to hear our thoughts. And so in the process,
we had to sort of write for Peyton, right? Like, so as you could imagine, an Edgar Wright script is very Edgar Wright, right? So there was this process of sort of like stripping away kind of some of the the Edgar Wright-isms out of it and turning it into a new thing that wasn't quite so auteur driven. And so it was a little bit about like linking up with Peyton and saying like, well, what do you want out of this? And what can we do? So it was always like kind of the same story, but we definitely flipped it on its head pretty heavily. Like
because one of Peyton's things was I wanted to feel like a heist movie. Remember that? Like that was actually like even before we went down there, we were Zooming with Peyton, and even before we had the gig, he was like, you know, I want it to feel like Marvel's Ocean's 11, and right now I'm not feeling like that's entirely in place. And I think probably like our biggest claim to fame in the MCU, and the reason, and one of the first ideas we ever had for it was we were like, well, you know, if you want to have a heist movie, one of the biggest tropes of the heist movie is the tip that then leads to the preparation montage. And so we pitched the sequence of scenes that has sort of become like the Luis scene that everyone loves.
Yes.
Yeah, and
where he's breaking it down and doing his whole thing.
Yeah. And people, and they loved it, and he was, you know, Peyton was super excited and totally understood this idea of kind of like whip panning from thing to thing, and Pena brought this whole idea of kind of like a little bit of a vapid character to it. He said he based it on like one of his friends growing up in Chicago. He's like sort of like a little, he's like smart but not all there. And so the tip sequence just worked really, really well, to the point where then we got to push it through to the second one, right? Like it earned its place. But yeah, no, I would say that we pushed to try to get credit on the first one. Like we felt like we had done enough work to the point where we could at least attempt to do that. We didn't do it, but there was a lot going on, right? Like that's a whole.
You didn't end up pushing for it, you said, or
no, we did.
Did you go through like the arbitration process with anything like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys are comfortable talking about that in a public forum, but how was that?
Well,
no, I think we can talk about that.
Yeah, it's just another example of sort of like you know, when it comes to arbitration, it's so relative, and
which is, by the way, just for the audience, that's like the process when there's a dispute over who's credited on a screenplay.
Right.
The Writers Guild has this process where they figure out kind of, it's very difficult, like who, because people are contributing to the script, like who deserves to have their names.
Right.
Well, what's interesting about it is it doesn't even necessarily have to start with a dispute. It's just sometimes, most of the time on these big movies that Marvel does, there might be like 6 writers along the way, and each one feels like maybe their contribution to the process was important enough. And that's where you have to get arbitrators to come in, and it's usually the person that did like the first draft, because that's where you establish characters and story, you know, just basic plot.
The bones are always going to be the most important factor.
Yeah. Let's say you like rewrite every line of dialogue, but nothing else changed. Like that's not really going to get you credit as a writer on something, but it does become sort of like an interesting process. So we were like, we might as well try it.
Yeah. And it's funny, even though we didn't get credit on that movie, because we were the last writers, and we worked very closely with Paul, but because we were the last writers on, there are like all of these lines that we feel like very like proud of, and sort of feel a lot of ownership of, because you know, like the last iteration of all of these scenes, like that last layer of paint was ours in that movie. So but it's funny because like that last layer of paint, even though you watch the movie and you're like, that was mine, that was mine, that was mine, that was mine, it doesn't rise to the level of credit because the bones are someone else's.
Right.
So
they were good about it, in the sense that like they recognized the hard work that went in, because we came in 4 weeks before production. They already had sets built. Like they had a full production office. They had all like the gears were in motion. People were cast and yada yada. And now suddenly they don't have a director, and they've got a new director, and they've got to get these writers down to kind of like execute that director's vision. But we also have to use all these sets that we've already like been building and stuff. So like, you know, we played ball with them and we're good at it, and we didn't cause any problems. We just did our job and kind of got it done. And so when it came time to say like, all right, there's going to be an Ant-Man 2, everybody in the process was like, we should give these guys the chance.
These guys. Yeah.
That was a real cool move on their part. And then of course we're the first writers in, so the bones are ours and we get our names on the poster. That was sort of like the nice full circle moment there.
Someone else comes and paints their paint over you afterwards.
Right.
Yeah. The funny thing
all that. Yeah.
The Peyton Reed thing was funny because remember when I first saw the art, like the announcement that Peyton Reed was doing it, because my first PA job was on this sitcom that like got burned off like in less than one season, and Peyton Reed like directed the pilot and I think most of the
really?
It's just like these full service circle ones. And so it's like, oh, Peyton Reed, now he's doing Ant-Man, he's doing the sitcom, and like and then the next PA job, one of the showrunners was David Hemmingson, who then just wrote The Holdovers. And so there's just all these things where you're just like, your boss from when you were a PA on a sitcom that died is like now like doing these huge things. I don't know. That's
I mean, that's like, I feel like that's, you know, when it comes to people kind of entering into the screenwriting business, so many of their experiences are like that. Like, like the PAs on a project, people like you, right? Like you're a good guy, good girl, and whatever. And like, then somebody's just like gonna say, hey, this person's cool. And then they just like pull you out, and then suddenly you get to be somebody's assistant. And then next thing you know, you're making a little bit of money so you can afford your own apartment. And then now you have a little extra time to start writing your own scripts. Yeah. And that's, we've witnessed a lot of people sort of build careers off of that trajectory.
Yeah. Now, friends of ours who were, you know, sort of low-level executives who read the first draft of Gunfight, who are now like running top-tier companies and stuff. It's been cool to see the evolution.
Yeah,
that's awesome. So okay, so you Ant-Man, you coming on at the tail end. Now for Ant-Man and the Wasp, you're there from the beginning. So what is that process? Because you've gone from you two just by yourselves sharing a keyboard, you know, starting there, coming up with stories. Then obviously you've done a lot of studio things where you're dealing with notes and everything. But now like you're developing this story in the Marvel Cinematic Universe with all the
writer too.
With Paul was Paul.
Paul was always on board as a third writer.
As a third writer, doing it with Paul Rudd. So how do you start that process for the sequel?
Well, they have.
I remember where it started. Actually, I was like sitting in a room, and they had told us that they were going to bring us on, and they sent us a big packet of information that Marvel had compiled when they do these like company retreats. And so they go on these company retreats, and everybody just is like talking about what the upcoming movies are and all the ideas that come out of this company retreat. I'm assuming like while they're sitting around a campfire, and you know, like they all make their way into this, or at least like the ones that they liked. And they sent us that, and we read it, and we were like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then the first thought we had was, we like called each other after reading it, and we were like, we should do a shrinking car chase. And that was like where we started. And then we, you know, they brought us out to LA for, I think, 6 months. We would go into the office every day. I think even before that, we were going to meet Paul at his office in New York every day.
Spent a lot of time breaking story with Paul. Yeah,
it was just like this whole, because it's like part 2 could have been anything. And we all had various feelings about what it might have been. And I think some of where the third one went was definitely discussed in the context of what the second one could have been. But how do you like incrementally step franchise?
It could have been anything, though. It has to exist like within like this framework of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So like, how are you
Well,
like staying within the lines.
The thing about that though is that so part of the purpose of the retreat was to sort of create the sort of interwoven storyline of the MCU. So like at that time, it was, our movie was coming together and Ragnarok was coming together and Black Panther was coming together. And then, of course, down the hall, the Russos were figuring out Avengers, Endgame, or I guess Infinity at that point. Endgame? Both. But what was always interesting about Ant-Man was that one of the prime directives of Ant-Man was this character gives us a little bit of a break from the MCU mythology. So while Ragnarok has to figure out, where Thor fits into the whole thing, and obviously Black Panther became really important for the Avengers movies, we basically said, okay, Ant-Man has to start here, and we need to end him at a certain place. Like we did know that we sort of had to figure out how to end him in a place where the quantum realm was going to play a major role in the Endgame stories.
Right.
But between beginning and end, we literally talked about how Ant-Man is the kind of movie that could take place all on the surface of a table. And so we really had a lot of blue sky. And to some degree, that was a little paralyzing. I mean, there were days and days and days of us with Paul or us with Paul and Peyton and the producers sitting in a room, kind of just like bobbing back and forth and staring at the ceiling and being like, what if, and breaking
everybody's like, what could this be? Like, how big is this? How small is this? He's a strange character in the MCU,
Yeah.
Like, it's like, we're not talking about coming up with the next Iron Man movie, right? Where everybody knows that's like front and center prime character. Do whatever the hell you want.
Yeah.
Right. Like, have fun with it. We're still kind of testing the waters of do audiences even want to go see an Ant-Man movie? Like what do they like about it? What can we get away with here? And I think what was most fun coming out of that development process was really this idea of like Paul was good friends with, he had a good relationship with who's the physicist? Michael Green.
Name, but
Michael Green, like a famous physicist. He's written a bunch of books about the way the universe works, and we got into talking a lot about how well he can go big and small. That's kind of cool, it kind of runs its course pretty quickly on some level. But what he can definitely do is go quantum. And once you're quantum, you can affect time and space. So now we're Ant-Man is actually the key to the whole thing. Ant-Man can allow people to go travel back in time and space and retell this whole story. So it's it became a kind of a cool, some of that stuff was ideas are getting thrown from down the hall. We're in here banging our heads against the wall. Somebody's
a visitor
breaking into my room.
All right, I gotta ask, because you brought up physics. Was there any discussion at any point of non-quantum physics in terms of how much things weigh? Because it seems like
the tank
as much as the story needs it to weigh in that moment.
The tank keychain that Hank carries around in his pocket in the first movie that plays a big role in the climax.
Yeah.
The number of times we joked about how if you reduced a tank to the size of a keychain, that it would fall through the surface of the earth and burrow down to the Earth's core.
Yeah.
Because of its density. So at a certain point, also, if you go as big as he goes when he goes giant, your body would never recover. And we were aware of a lot of those things. And
well, we also had I think his name was like
Stavros. There was another physicist who came early on and gave us a whole sort of clinic. But eventually, we were like
big-time physicist from like USC's like leading physics department came and was there to answer all questions. And it becomes this thing where it's like, all right, so like when you go quantum, what does it look like down there? And in the back of your mind the whole time, you're like, all right, well, when you go quantum, you don't have eyeballs anymore.
Time moves backwards and forwards and in all directions at the same time. You'd go completely insane. So there was a conversation early on, and to Marvel's credit and Kevin Feige's credit, like one of his sort of superpowers is he kind of knows what audiences are going to care about and what they're not going to care about. He knows if we were like really focused on something where we were like there was one day where we were in a trailer on set trying to figure out like this MacGuffin, and we're like, well, the MacGuffin has to have lasers that do this and do that, but if they do that, then in order to break through, you have to do this and that. And Kevin like peeks in and he overhears the conversation, and he's like, none of that matters. It's a thing that does a thing. Go.
Just like go, because he's coming from a place of being a comic book fan. And when you read the panels of a comic book, that's kind of how story progresses, right? Like it doesn't get super bogged down in logic. And that's kind of the fun of those movies.
Yeah.
And so when we're trying to come in and be and be like logic police, it's like, no. We don't worry too much about that here. We're about like kind of having fun and making big superhero movies.
Yeah. The tank is a keychain. All right.
Yeah.
Moving on.
That's just what it is. All right. So once you guys get alignment on the story, I think I read in another interview, super long outlining process, right? Like to get that outline kind of set before you went to script. Is that accurate, or what was that like?
Months and months. Yeah. Like, because so once you start to get to a place where the, in these roundtable sessions, the story starts to find its form, then Gabe and I go down the hallway and sit in a smaller office, and we write outlines that are the entire movie. I mean, basically scriptments that were like 30, 40, 50 pages long. And then we would hand them in and we would get notes on them. And I think we probably did 10 different iterations of that for various versions of the film. Like we would go down the road on an iteration of the film, and then there'd come a moment where we were like, well, this isn't working. So let's abandon ship and try again. And so, reams and reams and reams of outlines. And the process, like once the outline sort of seems right to the executives and the creatives, then it goes up the chain. And I mean, everyone has a look at it, and only then do you go to script.
Yeah, okay. Because obviously it has to. Not only does it have to pass through a guy like Kevin Feige, but the Russos down the road here also are going to need to weigh in, because they're like, well, here's what we're planning on doing with Ant-Man, right? So it's like, that'll work. This will work. Okay, that'll work. And so it all kind of comes together in this. It's
just like a giant like conspiracy theorist board of just like lines and wires. Okay, so he has to end here. Yeah. He's here, and
a big
one of the coolest things that we ever did. Yeah. There's been a handful of moments in our career where the professional screenwriter sort of collided headlong with just the movie fan. Meeting and working with Paul was one of those. But when we were working on Ant-Man 2 and we needed to gut check a plot element in terms of how it worked with Endgame, they took us down the hall to where Marcus and McFeely and Joe and Anthony were working on boarding those two movies, and it was a conference room with every single scene from the beginning of Infinity to the end of Endgame carded out in order. And they basically gave us a tour of those two movies.
We were like, we know how it ends.
Yeah. And
we were like, take your cell phones away before you like went into that room, so you couldn't like.
They probably should have. They trusted us.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually curious though, because like in the writing of this, did the scripts and the outlines stay in the office? Like, did you have to do it on computers that were there, or like how tight was security?
They encrypted our computers.
That's true. They did that. Yeah.
We did that. And then in the development phase, it wasn't too bad. But yeah, once you're like your script's locked, then that becomes, there's a whole security apparatus to control that. It's funny because when Andrew and I were on set in Georgia, we brought a bunch of our stuff down, and then we put it all in a U-Haul truck and drove back up to New York. And then we had to drop off the U-Haul truck in Brooklyn, in like one of those sort of like industrial parts of Brooklyn, and at like 9 o'clock at night. And then we go back to the apartment where we were living together. And then I realized that I had left the screenplay for Ant-Man in the fucking U-Haul truck. And I go back and I'm like, oh my God, these guys, if they know what they've got, like they could probably make me give them like 10 grand for this. And I just called them up and I went back and they just gave it to me. I gave them like $50 or something.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was nice.
What is the process of the scripting? Like you're actually writing the script. And one other question kind of along the ways is how do you balance the humor, especially Ant-Man, which is definitely like, in the spectrum of Marvel movies, more on the comedic side. How do you balance the Marvel humor and Paul Rudd's humor kind of with the dramatic elements?
So there's a couple scenes I think like where that really actually became a big topic. So like, for example, in the first movie, we spent a ton of time talking about the scene where Ant-Man fights the Falcon, because it was the moment where the very specific tonal space of Ant-Man came up against the very specific, oh, hello.
Sorry, he's licking my hand, so he's going to join us.
What's his name?
This is Marlo.
Marlo?
Yeah.
Love it.
That's cool.
But it came up against the sort of tonal space of Avengers. And it was like, we really got into the science of that, because everything about Falcon has to be, he's a pro. He's an Avenger. If you're fighting the Falcon, it has to feel high stakes. He has to do really cool things. So like, that's like, you can't just have them punch each other, because Falcon has to do something. Like Falcon has to have the wherewithal to put together the fact that every single time Ant-Man does this, he shrinks. So he's able to go in and catch his thumb. That's something a smart Avenger would do. So you have to find those Avenger beats. But then at the same time, like what makes Ant-Man unique is that when he's fighting an Avenger, he's apologizing the whole time. He's punching him and he's saying, sorry. And he's ripping apart the interior of his jetpack. But he's like, oh, sorry, it's my bad. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. And so.
And I think a lot of that humor found its way into it almost on the day.
Yeah.
Like it was a straightforward scene. It was written from the perspective of kind of like telling story, and it needed to be done. And then they worked it out together and kind of like found a little bit of the personality in the scene as the shoot was happening. It was actually a really cool example of kind of how a scene like that could come together, because it wound up being a pretty fun scene. And it was a scene that nobody really knew what to do with before that. And then they added the like sort of the cherry on top just by, being characters and doing what characters do.
Yeah, but Paul has a natural way of like Ant-Man is Paul in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And then also each character has their own sort of sphere of tonal influence. Like take a movie like Civil War, for example, which has a very specific tone that's kind of dire. It's about like dead parents and friends going at each other's throats. But then like when the sphere of tonal influence of Ant-Man enters the picture, you get jokes. So we were living in that sphere of influence. So it was like, yes, there are dire stakes kind of outside this sphere that we're aware of, but inside the sphere, things can be a little bit more loose.
Yeah.
How much in that sphere of Ant-Man, like how much freedom where were you given freedom in the script, and where were you restricted when you're actually writing the scenes?
I would say we were probably given quite a bit of freedom.
Yeah.
As long as we knew where because like Andrew said, the outlines were getting approved. So that's like pure plot. And then, and so we know he's starting here. We're kind of jumping here. It's the relationship with his daughter that's kind of moving things along, and where it's all going to wind up. So that's like the general gist of like sort of the plot outline that everybody's going to agree on. Within the scenes, we're able to kind of have as much fun as we want to have, and it'll get like pulled back. And then on that particular one, Paul would then come in and probably write 90% of the jokes afterwards, and the humor, and you know, so it was like kind of constantly evolving, right? Yeah. Like it's not like one of these like speak what's on the page hardcore script scenarios with a director. It's like this thing can still be changing in the moment that we're shooting.
We would also do a ton of alts on set for the first movie. We would and this is also because I think Peyton and Paul both came from the comedy world, where we would have sides for the day where Gabe and I had written like 10 alts into a scene. And Peyton would look at the sides while they were filming, and before he would cut, he'd be like, try this one. And they would, and so we would get to like play around with the comedy as the cameras were rolling. That was actually a really cool way to find funny stuff.
What does on the day mean in a Marvel movie where so much there's like previs and CG and stuff? So like when you're talking about the scene where Ant-Man's like ripping up Falcon's suit or whatever like that, like,
right,
you know, that's all, most of it, it's like CG. So like, what is on the day, like what does filming it actually look like?
So and that particular example it's broken down between sort of where the actor is going to be present when Ant-Man's big, right?
Yeah.
And then everybody going into it knows that there's going to be these little moments when Ant-Man's really small and he's like tearing into his stuff, and that's all going to be ADR, right? So you get to write jokes and write stuff, but that's kind of a little pressure off, right? Like he's going to be in a booth later, ADR that stuff. And so there is sort of an awareness. I would say that the VFX people on a Marvel movie are about as important as the director is.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're doing like 50% of the movie, and they're there interacting with each other. It's like, okay, so what are we going to do here? How much of this is needed? So they're coordinating that, and they know exactly how that's all going to play out in the end, more or less.
There was quite a bit of practical too, though. I mean, like, obviously,
it really shrunk down. That was really how you really had.
We really shrunk it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but like that was actually shot in a field, and Mackie and Rudd were both there, and they filmed some of their fight scenes. We had stunt guys to do the real fighting. I mean, the scene of him standing in a field and going like this with his jetpack, like that was filmed like in a patch of grass, you know, in outside the studio. And so like, and also all of those, like a lot of sets that you would maybe think were too elaborate, you know, like Darren Cross's lab, for example, that's all built,
which is wild because I don't think they're really doing it that way these days.
I mean, like really like down in Peachtree, like the Marvel movies, I think, maybe they do more green screen now, but like back then,
not green screen. I think nowadays they're using
volume, right?
Like with Mandalorian,
right?
Yeah, it's all like LCD backdrop.
Yeah, I think it's called the volume, right? It's a giant wraparound screen. Yeah.
And you can put like tables in there to create like bar and stuff, but it's gonna create your back. I mean, it's like a huge development.
Yeah.
Honestly. I think it's like opened up so many opportunities for being able to shoot things at a budget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then there were also days where we were like sitting there with, you know, Paul in front of a, then back then it was blue screen or green screen, you know, like going quantum, and the day was just us sitting there in Video Village watching, you know, Paul's face behind glass, just reacting to stuff. So there were days that were like, yeah, we're just here because they paid us to be here, versus days that were instrumental in heavy dialogue scenes.
What was it like, when did you leave exit the project, and did other people come in to replace you or finish it off?
Yeah, we got rewritten on the second movie, so it was it came full circle for us. We did the first pass, we broke the story, and then we did the first draft. And I think I'm still proud of this for this. We took a big swing on that draft. Like we went really wild, and we knew we were taking a risk. And when they saw the work that we did, they were like, this is great, guys, but time to bring in some new voices, because that's just how they roll. So
we had a scene where the whole crew of Ant-Man 2 shrunk down in Luis's van, falls off of an overpass, and lands through like the opening of an RV that's going on vacation with like a weird mom and dad and like kind of a strange little crazy 12-year-old and a dog. And then the kid at the campsite is like lighting things on fire, and he slathers peanut butter on the van. He finds it thinking it's like a little like Hot Wheels truck, and he feeds it to the dog. And so then like it became like inner space for a little while. Like there was like a 15 minutes of that movie where like they were just being like digested.
That reminds me of like Magic School Bus.
Yeah.
And those are all of our reference points too. And it's funny because like we called it the campfire scene, where it's like in all of these big adventure movies, there's always a beat about halfway through the movie where all the characters have to sit down in a moment where they're around a campfire of sorts and they talk it out, you know? And we were like, wouldn't it be funny if the campfire scene in Ant-Man 2 was them just like waiting to get shit out of a dog because they have to keep telling Hank they're not going to grow and explode the dog. So anyway,
they can explode the dog and kill the dog. Like
that's great, because then like the cuter the dog you cast, the funnier like that bit.
Yeah, and Marvel was like, no.
Right, so you get replaced when you get axed. Just to, how does it feel? I mean, are you like, okay, I did a job, we're all professionals? Or are you like, oh,
I think for us it was a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Like, you know, we definitely were like, we're all professionals. We know this is kind of how the process is, right? Like we expected it.
Yeah.
It was gonna happen one way or the other, but it doesn't like, you know, soothe the burn and anymore. You know, you're like, you kind of think that that's your project at that point. You've been on it for X amount of months or whatever, a year. And so, yeah, it's like, it's a little bit of both. I think we've gotten good at just kind of moving forward on those things, especially when you're dealing with big studio stuff.
Yeah.
Like big studio stuff is always gonna seek out different voices, and it's just gonna be, like sometimes it's just like the studio, like, you know, wants a certain type of humor injected into the script, and they're like, well, we've worked with this guy and he's really good at that kind of humor, so we're gonna like bring him on to do a pass to do that kind of humor on this. But you know, they tell you that it's still your baby and everything.
Did it after that experience, did you want more big studio projects? Because I know like some writers, directors, creators have gone through the sort of big studio machine and been like, that is gonna chew me up, that's not for me. Did you guys were you like sign me up for another one, or like no?
I think we've always liked doing both. Because like the one nice thing about working for a big studio movie, especially like Marvel, is that you're working for you're making something that's pre-greenlit. It's a very, very rare privilege to say this movie's coming out whether we like it or not. So we have to get moving on it and we have to write something. So I mean, the evidence was that we went straight from Marvel to Transformers. And we spent, the next 6 years of our lives writing a Transformers animated movie.
But in the interim, we've written several like smaller scripts that are weird as hell. And
you let your freak flag fly,
Yeah. In our various phases of like kind of getting going in a more indie way. And you start to learn like kind of the pros and cons of both. Because when you write like a smaller film nowadays in Hollywood, it's kind of like everything that's not IP based is kind of going to be considered a smaller film, right? So that's kind of getting its funding from quote unquote like indie sources, and in the process of that, money comes in, money falls out. You get used to the idea that like it could take years.
Yeah.
If you're lucky that this thing gets made. It's just sort of like that. And I think that's what we've learned over a while, or not even learned. I think that we just really like writing screenplays.
Yeah.
I think the two of us like have a lot of fun together, just like breaking story and knowing that we're going to get paid to do this. So we get to go into our office and mess around and just like throw weird ideas. It feels like a privilege. So it's kind of like, even if it doesn't get made, it's a super cool job either way.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like we try to like latch onto that just because it's just kind of, it's especially if we have something that we're working on, it's kind of just like a fun thing to get up and get into every day. Right. So, and it's kind of abstract sometimes. You don't know where it's going. But if we were fortunate enough to like maybe get somebody to buy it ahead of time, or we're making some money off of it, like that's the exciting part of it. I start to lose interest in it the moment that like the script's out the door.
Yeah. And
we're talking about like casting and money and all that stuff. I personally,
the play is over. Yeah.
I just want to like get back into like doing some other weird story.
That's awesome, guys. We're running out of time here. There are a lot of questions we didn't get to. I want to do one question just because he's asked this question like 10 times in the chat, so I want to get your answer to this.
Answer.
Do you follow the hero's journey in your films? And if so, how important do you consider it? I think we can answer this one directly, but also more generally, do you guys follow specific structures or templates in a sense of when you're thinking of your stories, or does it build organically depending on the project?
Yes, but not always the same one.
Okay.
And it's funny because a major feature of our career was where we went from being these sort of chaos agents of these like young writers who didn't necessarily follow the rules, to the moment we realized, our lives would be a lot easier if we really started to sort of respect structure. And we actually sort of later in our career than probably would have made sense. We did a deep dive and we learned we learned every structure. Like we've studied, the hero's journey, the 5-act structure, all the iterations of the 3-act structure. And I think that like there are kernels of wisdom in them that we have come to really respect. The notion of kind of like leaving your comfort zone and entering the unknown at the Act 2 break, where we are. I think that like maybe the most important beat for us, correct me if I'm wrong, Gabe, has tended to be the midpoint. We focus a lot on midpoints and sort of what they mean in the story and what the rhythm of a midpoint is, and the sort of the no going back, whatever that means for the plot. So we all very aware of it.
Midpoint became hugely important in terms of keeping your story on track. I think keeping your third act relevant was something that we really learned. It's not like your third act is not an afterthought. It's like a functional part of the organism of the story. So it's, in every iteration of these structure breakdowns, there's like real wisdom, but when you read all of them, they're all kind of saying the same thing, right? So it doesn't matter if you're talking about 5 acts or 3 or follow. We don't tend to follow like rigid structures when you like break it down into like a bajillion beats, but I do think that it's hugely important to think about your inciting incidents and what page your first act break is going to be on, because people do not want to read a story where nothing's happened until page 35, right?
Yeah. That's incredibly important, because I think that maybe the most important thing that we've learned is like, don't sort of like approach the hero's journey in the sense that like your plot needs to sort of fall into those categories, because that's too prescriptive. But from a rhythm standpoint, if your screenplay hasn't done something interesting by page 10 or 15 with an inciting incident, the reader's going to get bored. If you haven't transitioned from setup to the meat of your tale somewhere around page 25 or 30, the reader's going to get bored. Like the pinch in the middle of 2A is really just a way of saying you should do something that complicates things somewhere around page 40. Because if you don't, the reader's going to get bored. So that's been incredibly useful for us.
Yeah.
One rule of thumb that I heard that I always liked is that like something should happen every 15 pages. Like, just like something should happen every page, but like something big should happen roughly every 15 pages. And and if you kind of do that and are moving towards,
And one thing that I guess we could tell people about that I think was really useful for us is that when we started working a lot with the Russo brothers, right? And their breakdown of a script was always a first act, there was a 2A, and there was a 2B, and then there was a third act, and the 2A was always bisected by something they called a pinch. And 2B was always bisected by something they called a pinch. So it was kind of like 2A has a midpoint, 2B has a midpoint, and then there's a third act, right? So it was just like a really clear way, especially when you're making movies like The Avengers, that like you said, every 15 minutes, something meaningful is happening.
Yeah.
Something that turns the story is constantly happening at about those intervals, right? So we were coming into it sort of thinking about structure in a whole variety of ways. And then we saw like, oh, that's interesting. That's how they do it. Right. Like, so everybody's got their own thing.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So last thing, any words of wisdom or advice you want to leave the audience with before we go? Perhaps something that served you well, or a lesson you've learned over your careers, or just sort of anything. It can be career or craft.
It's a good question.
I would say from a purely career standpoint, not an artistic standpoint necessarily, like really work on your ability to be disappointed, because I think that we're all sort of building toward the goal of getting a movie made, but there are so many disappointments along the way that I think that like the artistic temperament, especially the writerly temperament of like, I know my story best, I know my characters best. We've seen a lot of really talented writers either move into other businesses or just not make it because they don't have the stomach for disappointment and the humility, I guess, to just say like, well, I'm happy to be here. which you have to, sometimes you have to watch your thing get torn to shreds and just be like, I'm happy to be here. And it's like, you're making movies, and that's the goal. So I would say, especially if you're young in the business, steel yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't want to be stubborn. You want to be, it is a collaborative system, right? So the screenwriter is just one part of it. And then beyond that, I don't know. I just like, I think what served us really well is kind of just a general passion to really do it. Like it's a lot of work, and a lot of things have to kind of fall secondary to it. Like we have to put it. It's not an everyday job. You don't get lunch breaks. And sometimes you're just going on marathons, and you have to tell your significant other, like, don't bother me for a while. And that has to be kind of like what's important. And everybody around you has to kind of know that, because that's just how it works.
Yeah. You have to love it to deal with disappointment.
Yeah. That's great. So some encouraging, uplifting news to end with. Like, get ready for disappointment, guys. No, I mean, but like, that's so real, is that like, there's this maxim, like, nothing happens in Hollywood until it does. And even then it might not, so like you have to love the process, because if you're focused on the end result, you're going to get crushed. Right. The disappointment. But if you love the process, then it's going to be very joyous.
That is a much better way of saying what I said.
David Lynch. It's funny. I saw this quote today, I think. David Lynch basically said that like a pro writer is an amateur that stuck around. And I think that's very true.
That's awesome. All right, guys. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's question. Maybe, well, first off, we're going to be doing more events in April, and maybe we'll get Andrew and Gabe back to do more craft talks, because there's more I wanted to ask about their writing process, but we kind of got over the Marvel path, and that was really fun. But that's it. So thank you so much. Andrew and Gabe, stick around for a second, but everyone else, have a great night and happy writing, everyone. Thanks for coming. So we'll see you later.
Good night, everybody.